Bashbot presents the Magnus Archives. Fan episode, Sirens Call. Statement of Amy Kalu regarding her near-death experience while cave diving. Original statement given July 20th, 2010. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. My parents were the ones to introduce me to caving, potholing as it's lovingly called here. My parents took me to Wookey Hole Caves, specifically on a boat tour when I was 10. Most kids would have been terrified, but me, I loved it. I thought it was so cool. Cut to 15 years later and I've been in most of the dry caves in the UK. Dry potholing is definitely scary in its own way. Tunnels so small you have to crawl on your belly to get through. Sharp rocks that can cut you like a razor. Darkness so deep your flashlight can't penetrate it. I'm sure you guys have lots of ghost stories about dry caving, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I started cave diving in my early 20s. When Camilla told me there was a sport that combined my interest in caving and my interest in the ocean, I was hooked to say the least. So began my cave diving journey. For a good couple of years and multiple trips, everything went fine. Of course, there were close calls and bumps, but that's to be expected in extreme sports like this. It was only when I graduated when the incident happened. After I graduated in 2009, my caving buddies, John Potts, Sia Singh, Lewis Young, Camilla and I decided to celebrate by booking a trip to the Bahamas to visit the island Andros. Specifically, to visit and explore a recently discovered blue hole. A blue hole is a large underwater sinkhole formed thousands of years ago. They can range in depth, size, shape, etc. Another notable feature of blue holes is, like most caves, they can have small passageways leading to other areas. Take, for instance, Four Sharks Blue Hole. There's a tiny hole deep in its complex that leads to a huge cavern that hasn't even been mapped yet. All that to say, blue holes are a cave diver's dream. Before I get into the incident, I need to explain who Camilla was. Camilla Serena was a former caving friend I met while I was still in high school. Camilla was much more of a thrill seeker than I am. The first and only time we went caving together was in Lost John's Cave. She damn near drowned after getting stuck in a submerged bit. She laughed about it, but I almost had a heart attack. Camilla wasn't the smallest girl either, but she didn't care. She'd try to squeeze through the smallest passages even rail-thin cavers wouldn't dare try. Camilla loved caving. Despite the hardships and almost dying, it never seemed to faze her. The plan was simple. We would spend a few days practice diving to get our bodies used to the depths we were going to, rest to clear the excess nitrogen, and go down to explore the blue hole. The blue hole was in a part of Andros where not a lot of people live, so when we got there on what was supposed to be the first trip, it was just us and the clear blue waters. The blue hole itself was huge, its vast opening swallowing all the light that fell into it, even with the sun beating down on us. The rays barely penetrated into the inky darkness. The water was cold when we put all our gear on and got in. It took us a minute to adjust, and with a nod to Lewis, who decided to stay back, we slowly began our descent. There were small groups of fish silently swimming as we swam down to the light sand bed that surrounded the opening. John and Sia were behind me as Camilla eagerly swam down to the opening. She stopped as she was about to enter, waiting for us to catch up, and we went in. The blue hole was similar to Four Sharks Blue Hole in the sense that once inside it wasn't a straight down dive. It slanted ever so slightly. We turned on our lamps as we entered the hole. The walls were jagged and uneven. They looked vaguely like teeth under the harsh light of our lamps. We had to be careful, since there wasn't a line we could easily get lost. Though our lamps were good, in a small tunnel like the one we were going down, we could easily cause a silt out, which basically is the sediment that coats the caves coming loose and reducing our visibility to almost zero. The three of us were being careful, but Camilla was going way too fast. I tried to speed up while not kicking up too much sediment. I wanted to catch up with her so I could signal her to slow down, but at that point she'd kicked up a bit of sediment and it took me and the others a minute to orient ourselves and navigate through the dusty water. I could tell Sia and John were getting irritated with Camilla. They hadn't been on dives with her before, so they really didn't know how she could be. I continued after her and nearly rammed into her. She was still, and when I got to see what she was looking at, I saw we reached the main cavern. It was huge. Our lamps barely pierced through the thick, dark water. Once John and Sia caught up, we began to explore, hugging the walls of the cavern as to not get lost. The walls were covered in rough carbonate rock that looked a pale blue under the light of our lanterns. I made sure to check to see how much oxygen I had left. Luckily, I had enough so we could stay down for a bit longer. As we floated around the cavern, something must have caught Camilla's eyes because she suddenly started down toward a much further part on the wall we were swimming around. I went after her, trying to get her attention to signal her to slow down. She didn't seem to see me or care. I looked back up at John and Sia, who both gave me a puzzled and concerned look. I signaled them to stay there and slowly went after her. I found Camilla a couple meters down. She was still, shining her light on a small opening in the rock. I swam up to her and got her attention. She silently looked at me and gestured to the opening. She wanted to go inside. Obviously, this was an insane idea. The opening was far too small to fit her, let alone the tanks and equipment she had on. I shook my head and gestured for her to go back with me. Camilla blankly stared at me for a moment and then turned back to the opening. She began to swim closer. I gingerly followed after her. If she was going in, she wasn't going in alone. Camilla took hold of one of her oxygen tanks and side-mounted them so she could get through. She looked back at me, and I did the same. And like that, she carefully began to worm her way through the small opening and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't want to go in. It was a stupid idea, but Camilla was my friend. I trusted her, so I went in after her. The tunnel the opening led into was even smaller than the blue hole opening, and worst of all, was incredibly uneven. Rocks jutted out from the floor and ceiling, and walls were rough and jagged. I could see Camilla swimming through them. What surprised me is she really didn't kick up much sediment. I struggled to navigate through the rough terrain. I kept kicking up a little bit of sediment and getting temporarily blinded. I looked at my oxygen levels and they were getting low. They were at the point where we would need to turn back as to not to run out. That's when I started to panic. If my oxygen was low, hers was too. I started to swim faster, almost slamming into one of the rocks. I tried to calm my breathing so I wouldn't waste my oxygen, but I was struggling. I saw over one particularly big rock the silhouette of Camilla. She was facing away from me, looking at something. I squeezed past the rock and was going to grab her to pull her back so we could leave, but I stopped. I got a better look at Camilla and realized she wasn't facing away from me. She was stuck in the rock in front of her. I saw the outline of the rock. It fit her almost perfectly and was sucking her in. I almost screamed. I frantically grabbed her arm and tried to pull her out with all my strength. After a few tries, I managed to get her out. I was so relieved and pulled her close to me so I could drag her and get help, but when I turned her around, I froze. It wasn't the fact that her goggles and breathing apparatus were gone that made me push her away and swim as fast as I could to get out of that tunnel. It was her face. Her face was covered in silt. Her eyes were wide and bulging. They stared into me. And her mouth was wide and hung open, impossibly wide. Her mouth was dark. I couldn't see anything inside. I violently pushed her away. She slammed into the hole that was sucking her in. I turned to swim past the rock I had struggled to get over when she grabbed my leg. I suppressed a scream as I aggressively tried to kick her off me. I got free after a moment of struggling and tried to swim as fast as I could. She had pulled off one of my fins in the process, which made it much harder to swim, but that didn't stop me. I dove through the rocks. I could feel her behind me. She was grabbing at me, trying to pull me back into that place. I looked back. She was getting closer to me, her horrible mouth seeming to be laughing through the water. I slammed head first into one of the rocks while I was distracted by her. Sharp pain shot through my head, and to my horror, my breathing apparatus came flying out of my mouth. I frantically waved my arms around, trying to grab it. I couldn't see anything through the awful pain in my head. That was when Camilla grabbed my flailing hand. She'd pulled me back with surprising strength. I tried to wrench my hand out of her grasp, but she held on. I used my other arm to try to punch her. I punched her hard in the ear, and she let go of me, and I tried to swim away, still disoriented from my head. Camilla lunged at me. My punch seemingly angered her. She grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the rough tunnel wall. Her mouth still hung open. Her eyes were red and bloodshot. They looked like they were about to burst under the pressure of the ocean. A dark cloud of blood surrounded her head. She held me there as I struggled against her grip. I saw her other hand reach for my face, and she began to claw at my mouth. She tried to force my mouth open. I frantically kicked and punched her, but it was no use. She wrenched my mouth open and let go of me. Water poured into my mouth, down my throat and into my lungs. It felt like it was freezing my insides. My body tried to vomit, but more water poured in. Camilla stared at me, her still open mouth turning into a sick smile. I was getting weak. Before I passed out, I saw during our struggle we had kicked up a lot of sediment and a decent-sized rock was floating within my arm's reach. Camilla failed to notice as I grabbed it and with my last bit of strength, swung it at her head. She looked like she cried out in pain and shock as even more blood began to seep out of her. That's when everything went dark. I woke up in the hospital. Apparently Sia and John followed me after a couple of minutes and found me floating in the cave. Authorities never found Camilla's body. I don't go cave diving anymore, not even potholing. I can't go near water without panicking, not because I almost drowned, but because I keep seeing her looking up at me through the waves, beckoning me to join her in the blue hole's caverns. Statement ends. Nitrogen narcosis definitely messes with one's motor functions and cognitive abilities. Severe nitrogen narcosis can sometimes even cause hallucinations. Miss Serena is still missing according to Bahamas authorities, with no leads. It's sad to say, but Miss Serena definitely suffered the same fate. What's interesting is when divers went to try to investigate the tunnel this all took place in, they couldn't find any tunnel anywhere in the blue hole. End recording.
Hey there, so quick message from me. This is my first time narrating my own little ghost story, I guess. So thank you for listening if you got all the way through, and I'd like to apologize if any parts got awkward. I had to cut out a little bits of me messing up and stuff. But with that being said, I'm relatively proud of this. Thank you to my beta reader for reading the first bit, and then I rush through it a bit, but yeah, have a nice day. Thank you.